All right, good evening and happy Constitution Day. My name is Crystal Branton, Outreach Manager at WHUT, located on the campus of Howard University in Washington, D.C. Tonight, we will engage in an in-depth discussion about the Constitution, a document that dates back to September 17th, 1787. Yes, many have argued that it is a masterpiece that has withstood the test of time, while others are ready to trade it in for something more contemporary, inclusive, and concise. We will travel with Judge Ginsburg as he meets with people around the country, asking challenging questions while recording his interactions with those that are willing to share their personal opinions without any reservations. And audience members, we also ask that you do the same on this evening. Also, tonight's episode entitled Our Constitution at Risk, along with two others, will air on WHUT on the following dates and times. A Constitution in Writing, Saturday, September 19th at 7 p.m. and Sunday, October 4th at 11 a.m. A Constitution for All, Saturday, September 26th at 7 p.m. And again on Sunday, October 4th at 12 p.m. And finally, Our Constitution at Risk, which we will be reviewing tonight, Saturday, October 3rd at 7 p.m. And again, on Sunday, October 4th at 1 p.m. Next, plans are also underway for the premiere of episode 6 of Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates. We will take a glimpse into the lives of individuals such as Jordan Peele, Gayle King, Melissa McCarthy, RuPaul, Scarlett Johansson, and more. This event will be held virtually on Thursday, October 15th at 6:30 p.m. And registration is free, and this event, of course, is open to the public. Furthermore, I want to thank our virtual exhibitors and partners, Howard University, School of Law, American Constitution Society, HU School of Law's chapter and its members, Larry Bryant, Community Engagement Manager, and entire American Civil Liberties Union team, along with the Stand Together organization and its staff for accepting our invitation. You are appreciated. Finally, on behalf of the entire WHUT team, we wish to also express our gratitude for our esteemed moderator and panelists that have joined us tonight, Professor Crooms Robinson, Shelby Emmett, Professor Stephen Jamar, and Gregory Brown. Remember to visit WHUT.org for additional information and to RSVP for upcoming events. Enjoy the evening.
I knew a man, an African-American man, who was born here in Baltimore in 1908, in the days of segregation. He grew up on this street, played in this neighborhood. His father was a porter on a train, and his mother was a school teacher. When he graduated from high school, his parents scraped to put him through college and scraped again to put him through law school. He wanted to go to the University of Maryland Law School, but he knew they wouldn't admit him because of his race. So he went to Howard University Law School in Washington, D.C., and was graduated first in his class. 2 years later, he turned around and sued the University of Maryland Law School for discrimination and won. And his client became their first black student. For the next few decades, he spent a lot of time in court. He became America's leading civil rights lawyer. He represented, defended men accused of rape and murder in the Deep South, risking his life to save theirs. While trying to save two men from being lynched, he was almost lynched himself. He was the bravest man I've ever known. In 1954, he argued a landmark case before the Supreme Court that challenged the legacy of Plessy versus Ferguson, widely known as Brown versus Board of Education. That man, who was a victim of segregation, who was a lawyer for the NAACP, who argued Brown versus Board, that was Thurgood Marshall. In 1967, he became the first African-American justice ever to serve on the United States Supreme Court. And I had the honor of serving as one of his law clerks there. Marshall understood the benefit of having a written constitution. Laws can change with the whims of the people, he said. But the Constitution does not change when mores and customs change. In Plessy, the Supreme Court tragically bent to the customs of the day and created the legal problem the Warren Court faced in Brown.
When Chief Justice Warren writes Brown, he realizes that it's going to be monumental.
It's probably the most iconic case in all of our legal history.
It's almost a moral decision. It is good when those decisions are unanimous.
So Warren lobbies his brethren, and he eventually convinces all of them to come aboard, even the ones who were a bit skeptical about whether this was a good idea or not. Brown says separating the races, just to separate them, is not equal.
I think separate but equal is a different form of being afraid of other people.
You can't have something separate be equal.
The court said the mere fact of racial separation creates inequality because it is the government creating a second-class citizenship.
It's a badge of inferiority. It's a stigma.
In the next decade, a series of landmark laws and lawsuits outlaws segregation in places of public accommodation, from buses and trains to restaurants and hotels.
Brown versus Board of Education absolutely changed my life. I went to Cornell University when Cornell University decided that it was time for Cornell not to be basically all rich white people. I would have gone to a small women's college or a small black college, and I just wouldn't be who I am.
Affirmative action is so difficult because it calls into question two different visions of equality, and the Constitution doesn't provide us a clear answer.
Say you have a job to fill, or someone has a job to fill. Is it appropriate for them to take into account the skin color of the applicants?
It's a complicated question. I think that people should hire the best person qualified.
What is the right balance between rectifying the sins of the past and focusing more specifically on individuals in the present?
Affirmative action provides opportunities to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford those opportunities.
It shouldn't matter what sex you are, what color your skin, shouldn't matter anything. Can you do the job?
Because, you know, a purist would say we shouldn't have any kind of race discrimination, and a non-purist would say, yeah, except after 200 years of slavery and then 100 years of Jim Crow, we have a national stain on our honor.
Would it offend me if someone takes that into account? No.
People don't know how to prevent their personal biases from coloring their decisions.
It's not like affirmative action is anything new, and it's only been for African Americans. Rich white guys have been affirmatively acted upon for years.
Some groups have a harder time, even when they're qualified.
Will affirmative action be here for the ages? Probably not.
When Justice Sandra Day O'Connor cast the deciding vote upholding a state university's affirmative action program, she wrote, "We expect that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary." That was in 2003. In not very many more years, we'll know whether she was correct. Freedom needs more than celebrating. It needs defending. And that takes guts.
My great-grandfather's first cousin was a shoemaker. He challenged the Separate Car Act of Louisiana, which mandated separate accommodations for people of different races. The railroad was partner in this attempt to change the law. It cost them a lot of money to change cars when it was easier to just let all passengers ride the same car. He was elected because of his complexion, that he would appear to be someone of the white race. There was this thing called a one-drop rule. If you had one drop of African blood in you, you were mixed race. He boarded the train car, and the conductor, as well as the arresting officer, were all in on this plan to fight the segregation laws of Louisiana. So the conductor approached him and asked him, was he a person of color? And he responded, yes, I'm a person of color. I purchased my first-class ticket, and I'm gonna go to Covington on this train. Upon his arrest, he was removed from that train and brought to criminal court. My name is Keith Plessy, and my great-grandfather's cousin's name was Homer Plessy. 58 years before Rosa Parks protested on a Montgomery, Alabama bus the right to sit where she pleased, Homer Plessy was battling for the right to sit where he pleased in 1892 on the East Louisiana Railroad passenger train.
In 1896, the landmark case of Plessy versus Ferguson reaches the Supreme Court. Plessy's lawyers argued that the state law violated the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which had been ratified 25 years earlier.
No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws.
The Supreme Court said the Constitution must be interpreted to reflect the customs and traditions of the people. So much for equal protection.
The Supreme Court, after all, is a reflection of society, and so when our society was deeply racist, so was the court.
Whatever you want to do to carry on the vestiges of slavery, we're going to say that's okay for you to do, and we're going to actually give you cover, right?
One justice dissented, John Marshall Harlan.
He stated, "Our Constitution is colorblind. All citizens are equal before the law. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful." Justice John Marshall Harlan got it right.
When the Supreme Court speaks, people can sort of put its pronouncements, its decision, next to the actual Constitution as it's written and say, wait a minute, you guys and gals made that up.
I never realized that my great-great-grandfather was the judge in the infamous case of Plessy versus Ferguson. He ruled against Homer Plessy. This is one of the 3 most important civil rights cases in American legal history, and we are descendants of it.
Our foundation is a flip on the script as opposed to Plessy versus Ferguson. We are Plessy and Ferguson.
We're dedicated to identifying historic sites where African-American history has occurred but not been recognized by the state.
The Plessy versus Ferguson case resulted in the United States Supreme Court adopting separate but equal as the law of the land. The suffering that resulted from that case was a national disaster. It reached out into every facet of life.
First time I came to Washington, I saw on the station separate fountains, water fountains for whites and for coloreds. I was really shocked. That was in 1967, more than 100 years since the Civil War. That was the legacy of Plessy versus Ferguson.
Growing up in New Orleans, we knew what we couldn't do, and we knew what the white people could do because we lived in the neighborhood with them. They could go anywhere. Sometimes in restaurants, we could buy food, but we had to go to a back window that said for colored only. My mother loved the opera, but we had to walk up 103 steps to sit in the crow's nest. My sister and I counted them every time. And the movie theaters that we could go to were segregated. The white people sat downstairs, and we sat upstairs. Living under segregation did something to your self-esteem. Because I remember as a child saying, well, I want to go on the roller coaster at the beach. And my parents said, no, we can't go on that. So you grew up with that pall over you, that you are not as good as we are. You can't do this. But my parents always said, one day it's going to be different.
Mrs. Morial's husband, Dutch, became the first black mayor of New Orleans in 1978. In 1994, her son Mark was also elected mayor.
As a kid growing up with pianos, I remember the first time I ever broke a string. My dad said, "You broke it, Charlie, you're gonna fix it." The first musical director of one of the casinos, he came to me and said, "Charlie, I have a lot of pianos here." So that's what started my career in piano tuning in Atlantic City.
At the beginning of the 20th century, Atlantic City was America's playground. But after World War II, its fortunes declined. The city then gambled on casinos and lost big. Much of America's playground is now a casino wasteland.
This building is not just walls. This building is a cross-section of my life. It's like a living, breathing thing. We were blessed to be able to come as immigrants to this country after what my parents had survived the Holocaust. And the idea of actually owning something that we couldn't be thrown out of was huge.
But maybe Charlie could be thrown out. In 2014, a state judge ruled the Casino Reinvestment Development Authority could seize Charlie's home, using the state's power of eminent domain.
And you have 45 days to vacate, and that it would be bulldozed as all the other buildings right next to me had been bulldozed.
Does the public use provision of the Fifth Amendment have any meaning whatsoever? And the Supreme Court's answer by a 5-4 vote was effectively no.
The Constitution provides that private property may be taken for a public use with just compensation paid. But the Supreme Court rewrote public use to read public purpose, which is much broader.
And the thing that was crazy in the Birnbaum case is they weren't even sure exactly what they were going to use it for or when they were going to use it.
They said, "We don't have to give you an answer." I'm thinking, where do we live? Is this Russia? Is this North Korea?
It's just a naked abuse of government power.
So Charlie went to court. 2 years later, the judge deemed the state's effort to oust Charlie a manifest abuse of the eminent domain power. New Jersey appealed, but in the end, Charlie prevailed. In the infamous case of Kelo versus New London, Suzette Kelo wasn't so lucky. The Supreme Court said, we can't decide what a public purpose is. We'll let the city councils decide that. That's good enough for us. Funny, but I had thought the justices were supposed to make constitutional decisions.
So the battle goes on.
Ernest Hemingway slept here. Now they do, descendants of Hemingway's six-toed cats. The Hemingway home is dedicated to preserving the legacy of author Ernest Hemingway and of his cats. In Key West, anything goes. Chickens need no reason to cross the road, nor a license, for that matter. But when the Federal Department of Agriculture got wind of the museum's cats, it dictated how they should be cared for.
The museum challenged it on Commerce Clause grounds and said these cats are marooned at the very southern tip of Florida, will never cross the state line, and furthermore, they were not bought or sold, they were merely born.
To the framers, commerce meant I send something to you in Boston when I'm in New York. That was interstate commerce of the kind that could be regulated. When two people in the same state traded something, that was not interstate commerce and therefore could not be federally regulated. That was the intention of the framers.
The framers didn't design an almighty federal government that could reach down right into your backyard. or barnyard.
During World War II, there was a farmer who grew grain, and he fed that grain to his own animals.
And the federal government had a program at the time that dictated how much wheat farmers could grow on their own land. And he said, hey, that's not constitutional. Why? Because I'm not engaged in interstate commerce.
But in Wickard versus Filburn, the highest court in the land thought otherwise.
And in a convoluted analysis, the Supreme Court declared that because that wheat would not be used in interstate commerce, it still impacted interstate commerce through some type of displacement.
So they're taking the Commerce Clause and stretching it like a rubber band to apply to any kind of business when it was originally meant just to be for cross-border commerce, like it says.
I agree, but some scholars disagree. In their view, there's little, if anything, beyond the regulatory authority of the federal government.
In an economy like ours, things really are interconnected. And what goes on one farmer's farm really does affect what happens elsewhere. And so when the Supreme Court says the Interstate Commerce Clause gives Congress the power to regulate things that seem awfully local, it's not just engaging in some kind of trap to expand federal power. It's recognizing an economic reality.
If the test under the Commerce Clause becomes, does it affect commerce, then everything affects commerce, whether you do something or don't do something.
Well, once you have the power over anything that affects commerce amongst the states, then you basically have the power over everything.
Everything? Even Hemingway's cats?
The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, and I kid you not, said that because the museum features these cats on its website and has cat-related merchandise in its gift shop, that is a substantial connection to interstate commerce, and that opens the door for the federal government to come in and exert control. Not making that up.
Hello, I am Larry Bryant, the Community Engagement Manager for the American Civil Liberties Union of the District of Columbia. The ACLU-DC works to protect, advance, and expand the civil rights and civil liberties of all of those who live, work, and visit the District of Columbia. The ACLU-DC strives to achieve long-term systemic change for the communities of DC, alongside and in coalition with many grassroots and locally based nonprofit partners. Our issue areas include, but are not limited to, criminal justice reform, disability rights, equal protection from discrimination, freedom of speech, police practices and police misconduct, privacy, racial justice, voting rights, gender equity, and youth and children's rights. And we do our work by filing lawsuits through policy and advocacy focused on the mayor and the DC Council, and through public education and community outreach to district residents like you. If you would like to know more about our work, follow us on social media or visit our website at www.acludc.org. Thank you.
Welcome to everyone who's joining us tonight. My name is Lisa Crims Robinson. I'm a professor at the Howard University School of Law, and I'll be your moderator tonight. I am joined by an esteemed panel of three individuals who will in fact introduce themselves, but I want to note we've got Gregory Brown, we've got Shelby Emmett, and we have Steve Jamar here. And I actually went in alphabetical order. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to tell you all a little bit about themselves before we get into the conversation.
Should I start? My name is Gregory Brown. I am a 3L at the Howard University School of Law in DC. I'm from Prince George's County, Maryland. Currently, I serve as the Vice President for the American Constitution Society at Howard Law. I also serve as the Secretary for the Student Bar Association. I actually have Professor Jamar for Constitutional Law too, so I can't wait to get started.
Hi, everybody. My name is Shelby Emmett. I am a First Amendment attorney and the director of free speech initiatives at Stand Together. Stand Together is a philanthropy organization, and in my department, I work specifically with other groups and people around the country to make sure that we're protecting free speech and also helping people understand the importance of it for our society so we can progress in a better direction.
Hi, I'm Stephen Jamar, and along with Professor Crooms Robinson, I also teach at Howard University School of Law, teaching constitutional law, among other subjects.
Okay, so I'm very happy to spend this evening with the three of you and the 100 and plus of the folks who have come to join us in our intimate little conversation that no one else will hear. So let me be the first to say, in a completely geeky way, Happy Constitution Day. It is an important day that we celebrate. Definitely we celebrate it at Howard, but I would presume that the vast majority of people in the United States don't even know that there is a Constitution Day, let alone what date it is. But having said that, we saw 4 clips that dealt with different issues, some of which are connected. So I want to start by asking about the connection between Brown and current issues regarding race-based affirmative action. One of the folks interviewed in the video, well, not just one, a number of folks in the video seem to make that connection, but I don't know that the connection is necessarily clear. So how is Brown relevant to current issues regarding race-based affirmative action? And the second part of the question is, what is the connection, if any, between desegregation on the one hand and integration, diversity, and inclusion on the other hand? And I can pick somebody, or one of you all can decide that you want to answer the question. I'll give you 3, 2, 1. Steve.
All right.
How do we get from Brown to affirmative action?
There's a well, we start out with Brown was a case where African Americans were being excluded, and the Supreme Court was faced with the decision of should we overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, which said separate but equal was okay. So at some level, it was a straightforward, simple case to simply say, no, separate cannot be equal. And Brown was just an exclusion type case. When we're looking at affirmative action, we're looking at trying to include historically excluded and marginalized peoples. And that's what affirmative action is doing. It's trying to get people who have been historically disadvantaged, either as a group or individually or by their background, to be included in all the benefits of society. So when we're looking at Brown, Brown was indeed about getting the first step toward inclusion, which was getting rid of exclusion.
Okay. Anybody else care to add to that?
Well, I think Brown also speaks to there's a difference between what the law and policy can do and then the rest of heart and culture and society, right? So I'm from Detroit originally, one of the most segregated states to this day. So you can go to a school in Detroit and you're going to see a majority Black and brown population. Across 8 Mile, you're going to see a majority white population. And some of that is based off culture and society. Some of that is through years and years of policies, whether that was redlining, whether it was literally, cutting a road through the freeway or making a freeway. And I think now you're starting to see almost like a Brown part 2, where we've taken the law, but now you look at things like zip codes determining policies. We're seeing the impact of COVID and just the different impacts. If you're like me and you grew up in a single parent household and your grandparents are in the house, I have no idea how my mom would have ensured that I got the quality education that I only got in spite of not living during COVID right now. So I think that what this shows is yes, right, you can have those ideals. We can say all people are created equal, all people deserve the same accommodations, but there also has to be this other side of it, which is the actual cultural heart change. And I think we see this still today now, right? You have the Black church, you have a white church, we still somewhat segregate ourselves and we see ourselves pulling ourselves back. And although you might have the rules saying that people can live together, I still think that we're still slowly moving towards that, where we actually have that change and that transition from law to actual hearts and minds. But I do think if you want to see a silver lining in the year of 2020 and all of the disasters that we've seen, I think more and more people are starting to really hone in on the importance of a quality education, regardless of where you're from. And those barriers, whether it was race or zip code or income, those are still major real barriers today that we face.
Right. Greg or Gregory? Sorry.
Yeah, either is fine. I would say that I don't think society has caught up to the court case yet. Separate but equal, was what was overturned. However, we continue to live our lives very separately, and I just feel that it's going to take more structurally for society to catch up with what the law currently is.
Okay. Can I follow up? What kind of structural change do you think would be necessary in order for what was articulated in Brown in terms of overturning separate but equal as articulated in Plessy to become a reality, not just for a few people, but for everybody?
Right. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is, property taxes funding schools. That has a lot to do with, why certain neighborhoods have disadvantaged schools, and why certain school districts, public school districts can send kids to Harvard and Yale, and why certain public school districts can't. That probably the first thing that comes to mind. The second thing is, it's related, but it comes to choosing where we live, and trying to choose where you can live after you've already been discriminated against, whether that's implicitly or explicitly, either being denied a bank loan, or not passing credit checks or things of that nature. And these are things that are problems on top of problems, but that all boil down to can we get to a place where we are equal, even in the places that we live.
Mm-hmm. And I think that part of what you're raising, actually a combination of the three of you all are raising, is something that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote about in one of his Atlantic articles. The connection, for example, between residential segregation and the call for reparations. So some might contend that the way we get to Brown is a road that leads through a real conversation and decision about whether reparations is going to be a reality, or if it's going to continue to be sort of a rhetorical thing that gets raised but is never met as a serious demand. Am I off base?
I think,
or is there something there?
Yeah, I think, Lisa, we've got, I'm more hopeful now, despite what's going on with the administration and a lot of the pain that we're experiencing, that what I am seeing is, for the first time in my life, in just the last 2 years, there are a huge number of white people who are taking their responsibility seriously. They are taking a look at things like white supremacy, and I mean, there's symbols of it, like Confederate monuments coming down, but I think that that's an extraordinary sea change to say it's not a Black problem, but it is our white problem. It is something that we need to be serious about. I think the second part of it is that we looked to the courts to say, oh, you can't exclude people. Well, our constitutional liberties are reasonably good at protecting at times against government intrusion, but they're very poor under our Constitution at the affirmative side, such as making sure you have an equality in education. And if you want to do that, that has to happen through the legislature. That has to happen through legislative action. So the remedies today do not come through the Supreme Court, certainly not this Supreme Court. And so we have to then be looking to these other legs. Well, that's not going to happen overnight, but I do have hope that over the next decade, we're going to see a sea change in the direction that at least many of us want to see and have been working toward and hoping for literally decades.
Absolutely. And I think that, thanks, Steve, that actually leads to my second question, which shifts from Brown to Plessy. And one thing that struck me in the video was something that Keith Plessy said. Keith Plessy said, and I'm paraphrasing, that Justice Harlan's dissent got it right. Made me think, okay, one, what is the it, right? And two, did he get it right? I mean, most of what's quoted from—
hell no.
Exactly. Most of what's quoted from that opinion is, you know, we're a colorblind society. Our society knows no caste. Read Isabel Wilkerson. But that is couched in language that if you read the whole dissent, it's a little disturbing. He says things like the white race has always been superior and there's nothing to indicate that that in fact is going to change. So, you know, basically, what do we have to lose if we concede equality in this particular area? It poses no threat to us. So I wonder, did Harlan get it right?
No.
That's a great question in terms of what we were speaking about earlier, right? If you're looking at a modern approach, and some people would say, okay, you've got the activist judges, right? They're creating law, they're not looking at the norms of society, and they're trying to push it past to something new, right? We've all lived through that in our own generation with the courts, right? And so if you're looking at it from that perspective, then the limited government, small government idea would be, well, you're keeping with the customs because that was the customs. And anyone that would say that that's not true, I'm not saying that was every single American. Obviously, you've always had Americans saying, hey, this is hypocritical. Look what we've written down. This doesn't match up. But what they were actually just saying was, look, are we really going to shake the nest that much? Because this is kind of the culture of what it is. What I think the bigger beauty of all of that is also in our modern times, sometimes I think society is too quick to put everything in the Supreme Court. Oh my gosh, it's good. We've literally surrendered ourselves to 9 people, right? Regardless of which side of the political aisle you're on. I don't think that was whatever was originally intended, and I don't think that's good for any of us. If it's up to a Harlan or a Black or a Walker or a Thurgood Marshall, regardless of where that is, I don't think any of us want our liberty, our future, my children's future, dependent on a 5-4 decision. And I think through time, we've noticed that the courts, you know, going back to Mulberry versus Madison, that kind of took on its own thing. But this idea that we just say the Supreme Court is the end all beautiful, most important thing in our system, I think Plessy is a perfect example of no, just because that these are, you know, people in robes and they've been destined to be the people that interpret a document does not necessarily mean that it's going to work out well for civil liberties and individual freedom.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, I would just say that no, he did not get it right. Harlan did not get it right. But just I would argue that his perspective, even in what was quoted in the documentary, has stood the test of time, especially in modern America, and even people who would call themselves liberal, especially white liberals. You know, they say, oh, we're in a colorblind society. We don't have caste systems. Black people are not objectively treated bad, blah, 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 to make themselves feel comfortable because it's not explicitly stated, but, you know, it is implicit in, you know, where we live, who gets policed, who doesn't get policed, you know, who gets jobs, who doesn't get jobs, who gets to go to certain universities and who doesn't. And But because that's not necessarily codified or explicit, it has lived on and is I would say, is the modern view of most of white suburbia. And white suburbia makes up a lot of Congress, and white suburbia makes up a lot of your ivory tower institutions. And because of that, those are where we're getting our laws from. We elect these people, and Congress is diversified, but it's still largely white and largely male and largely from the suburbs. So, it's kind of crazy to see how a dissent in a legal decision can, permeate its way into the culture.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Commerce Clause. Something that only constitutional law professors really like to do. Okay, so the clip that we looked at talked about Wickard versus Filburn. But I'm wondering, in the critique of the expansion of the Commerce Clause power, what happens when we come forward from Wickard and we stop at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, specifically Title II? So Rand Paul has been on the record and questioned whether, or actually he's asserted, he's not questioned it at all, he's asserted that Title II of the Civil Rights Act is unconstitutional. Title II regulates accommodations privately owned. And we know that Congress had to go that route because going directly from the Constitution, the obstacle was the civil rights cases, which are decided before Plessy. So I'm wondering, is it accurate? I mean, if you consider cases like Heart of Atlanta Motel, and one of my favorites, Katzenbach versus McClung, otherwise known as Ollie's barbecue case, is that too much of an expansion of the Commerce Clause?
Well, let me jump in and correct a little bit of history in two respects. First is, all of this goes back to a John Marshall opinion where in 38 or thereabouts, he wrote that the Commerce Clause does allow the government to extend to actions that have a substantial effect on interstate commerce.
Mm-hmm.
So that goes back to one of the people who was there at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And so to say that this is somehow newly minted is wrong. Secondly, the comment that was made that anything that affects, well, it has never been anything that affects. It has to have a substantial effect in aggregate, not just one person, but if you put all those wheat farmers together, you get the boom and bust. And so that's what the court was looking at. Also, the Constitution was written before there was steam engines, before there was an internet, before there was any of the technology, before the commerce that we have today. It's simply, the clause was written to change over time. All that said, they just have it wrong if they want to go way, way back. They have the history wrong. But all that to one side, I think that a very important point that takes us back to the Harlan opinion in Plessy and to the cases familiar to us like the civil rights cases and so on. The court, immediately after those amendments were adopted, came out and said, we're going to limit the power of those amendments. And they said that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and 1875 could not reach private conduct, even though that was clearly the intention of those amendments.
Mm-hmm.
And what do we see in this? We see a Supreme Court that throughout its history, except for 20 years, 25 years from 1954 on, has been supporting the white supremacist culture. And we see that specifically in Harlan's dissent. Now, I would love if we were all starting at the same starting place with the same chance that we could be colorblind. But that is not the reality, and it hasn't been the reality, and the Supreme Court has moved well back to being that pillar of the conservatism in that sense of preserving the economy and the structure that's in place.
Mm-hmm.
So sorry to rant, I don't want to take any more time here right now.
You got a rant. Anybody else?
I'll just point out that I do think historically one of the main themes that I think as Americans we don't spend enough time discussing is how the country and the relationship between the American citizen, the American person, and their federal government changed as a result of the Reconstruction Amendment. So I think this isn't another part of the documentary, but before, right, you would refer to what state you were from. And part of this Reconstruction battle culturally was also trying to, obviously through the 14th Amendment, to say, okay, this is what it means to be an American citizen. You actually had to define what that meant. And then you had to put some type of caveats to what that means. So I do think that there is a slightly difference of how, and I don't think we could prove this one way or the other, but how the founders and the Constitution was looking at it as these individual regions almost, right? Obviously coming out of the Articles of Confederation to what I would call almost a new American Constitution as a result of those civil rights amendments. And that did change not just the relationship federally to the state, but obviously the states to the federal government, and then the responsibility of the states to their citizens.
Okay.
I would say, just in response to your direct question about do cases like Heart of Atlanta Motel and things like that go too far? While I wanted, when I was a 1L reading that case, I wanted the outcome to be what it was. I wanted them to rule that, it was a substantial effect on interstate commerce. I wanted them to rule that they were discriminating and all of that. But even then, my legal, I guess, spidey senses were like, that's a bit of a stretch. Like that's a little bit of a, I guess just a bit of a reach in terms of, does it substantially affect and does it affect in interstate commerce even at all? Now, I would argue yes, a little bit, because you aren't allowed to discriminate in that way, and you are dealing with commerce. However, I'm not so sure if we can take that legal doctrine and expand it in a way that controls people's actions so locally. However, I do think there needs to be other legal strictures in place so that we don't even have to depend on the Commerce Clause for situations like that.
Okay, I've got time for
in the civil rights cases.
Question, because I've got an eminent domain question that I'm itching to ask, and that is, are there any circumstances under which a casino should be considered either a public use or a public purpose? And I'd add to that a baseball or a soccer stadium, a basketball arena, or a commercial development with privately owned businesses. Think of the DC waterfront. Should the government be able to take private property by way of eminent domain based on the notion of either public use or public purpose and build things that are owned and operated by private entities?
I think that Kelo was dead wrong in the private to private transfer of property being permitted under the eminent domain clause. But redevelopment, economic redevelopment, is certainly a public purpose, and taking property that's needed for redevelopment is a public use. So you're always going to have hard lines to draw. But I think that, I think the court really got it wrong, and the response of people across the country in their state and local legislatures was to say the court got it wrong and we're going to redefine eminent domain to be more narrowly decided.
The only thing that I would sort of add to the mix is, if we see particularly how redevelopment has happened in Washington, which is similar to the way it's happened elsewhere, it brings to mind Solange in some ways. It raises a question about who's part of the public, right? Because if the people who are being displaced as a result of the redevelopment, as it were, are part of the public, shouldn't where they end up be more of a concern, or at least part of the calculus in determining whether the taking was for a public use or a public purpose?
Well, I think in
I'm
the,
not
the
sure where we
strictest
got-
sense of the term, I don't know how far out when they wrote that they were expecting society to look at the value, right? So if the immediate need is, okay, going back to my hometown, Detroit, we build cars, we need to get more people into the factory, so let's build a freeway through everyone's neighborhood. If that short-term value was just, we need to make sure people can get to work, okay. But the long-term consequence of increased, discrimination, redlining, poverty, war on drugs, obviously not. But I don't know where that line is of, I think the same thing of, gentrification or anything else. Is the short-term economic increase worth the displacement? And that's the battles we still have today.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree. Sorry. And according to the chat, I think we've come to the end of our discussion. So I'm wrapping, and I'm following instructions. I have been instructed to encourage you all to stay for part 2. So we've got, I think it's 3 more segments queued up, and then the 4 of us will be back to have more of a conversation, and then we'll be looking for comments and questions from those of you all we can't see, but we know you're here by way of the counter. So stay tuned, stick with us, and we're about to go for part 2.
The framers gave us 3 branches of government with carefully separated powers. But the Congress and the President then created a 4th branch, so-called independent agencies, a whole alphabet soup.
They produce regulations, which are the primary law now. We live in the age of regulation.
There are over 180,000 pages in the Code of Federal Regulations. In 2016, the Congress passed 214 new laws. But the federal regulatory agencies issued 18 times as many, 3,853. And we didn't vote on this, and neither did our representatives in Congress. How did this happen?
What is the big one of the 1930s, the mother of all agencies?
An act was passed creating the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority.
Let's dam the river. Let's get power from that. Let's teach farmers to farm more productively.
There was this belief back in those days that essentially you could have government by expert. You just bring in the right experts and they'll know exactly how much coal we should produce and how many sneakers to have.
The architects, the research chemists, the agricultural experts.
To operate a scheme like that, you have to have executive agencies. That's where that came from.
With what safeguards have we delegated these powers? To whom exactly have we delegated them? What's the kind of scope? With what provisions for judicial review?
There's nothing magical about the institutional forms that the framers gave us. And if things adapt over time and seem to make sense, then that's good.
And if the legislative branch chooses to delegate so much of its power or pass laws that basically put all this power in agencies, then it seems like that's their prerogative to do it.
Now we have a federal government that intrudes into every aspect of everybody's life. I don't think that there is a person in the country who can go through a day without violating some federal regulation or rule.
And large chunks of the federal government are unconstitutional because there's simply no enumerated power to authorize what the federal government is doing.
When you talk about agencies, there's one word that's out of the discussion, and that is states.
Now, the federal government routinely taxes and takes more money than it needs solely to give it back to the states with conditions. Now we have agencies that have every element of a government unto themselves.
And they combine all the powers that the framers so carefully separated. They pass rules that have the force of law, legislating. They enforce those rules, an executive function. And they judge who's been in violation of those rules, a judicial function. Perhaps worst of all, as the framers feared, they are unaccountable to the people.
That is one of the most fundamental errors you can make in all of political science, to combine those powers in one branch, and we have done it.
"400 people will become American citizens today, taking the oath to the Constitution." We want new citizens to understand what it takes to sustain liberty. And so they have to pass a civics test. And to prepare for that, they study American history and the Constitution.
It was a difficult test, but it was good to know. It's good to study.
Where are you from, Avery?
I'm from Argentina.
I'm born in Bangladesh. I'm from Somalia.
Well, welcome to the United States.
Thank you
to
so much.
Citizenship. This is the lifeblood that renews us and continues to do so after 240 years.
I hereby declare on oath that I will support and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States of America. So help me God.
I want to be the very first person to congratulate you on becoming citizens of the United States of America.
The great safeguard of liberty is a government of laws and not of men. Our Constitution creates that government, but it works only if we, the people, know the Constitution and protect it.
We've been blessed, we've been lucky, but that may not last.
And too often people just think liberty just magically happens, we're entitled to it.
Our Constitution is only as strong as the people and their support of it.
We would miss the Constitution terribly if we didn't have it.
Republics are delicate. They have to be kept going over time. You can't just start the machine and let it run.
Well, Dr. Franklin, what have you given us?
Well, sir, a republic, if you can keep it.
That will be a challenge.
I think those are the most chilling words of any framer, because what he was saying is that we've given you a republic, but it's yours to lose. Every generation will have to step up and defend those liberties.
Or as an old song put it, freedom is a hard-won thing. You have to work for it, fight for it, day and night for it, and every generation has to win it again.
We're a beautiful city. We have the largest historic district in the country. We attract a lot of people.
I do daytime history tours, a little bit of everything. It's the perfect job for me.
This is a ghost tour. I am not a parapsychologist. I am not a psychic. I'm not a medium. I'm a tour guide.
We were the first walking ghost tour in the city of Savannah, and we've been at it for about 25 years.
We live in a time where information is on your cell phone, so people can quick fact check you. I've been fact checked before. It's a good thing I knew what I was talking about, but I think the free market takes care of itself because the bad tours, they just don't last.
Sometimes the federal government curbs our liberties in ways that seem petty, but other times it's a local government that is the problem. The Savannah City Council decided that tour guides needed to be regulated.
The city of Savannah required people to have a business license, on top of that to have a tour guide license. on top of passing this test that was full of obscure gotcha questions.
Where we just walked and where we drive every day is over dead bodies. They're everywhere, under your feet, they're everywhere.
You had to pass a physical.
Now, you are still on dead people. Dead people, dead people, dead, as far as you get right to that cop car, dead people.
And a criminal background check.
Dead people.
And honestly, the #1 question I get is, where's the bench in Forrest Gump? But you would have to pass that test just to tell somebody where the bench was.
Whether it's a little kid running a lemonade stand, somebody selling tacos out of a food truck, somebody braiding hair for money, I can almost guarantee you that somebody out there is trying to shut that person down because they don't like the competition. That's rent-seeking. You can go to the government and say, hey, she doesn't have a license. Would you shut her down for me?
I went down to City Hall with all of the paperwork and said, I don't think this is legal. And they smile and say, thank you very much. We've been doing it this way, and we plan to keep it that way.
We become a kind of a permission-based society. Don't do anything until you first get government permission.
And I did have a city official tell me, but just to let you know, the city gets sued a lot, and we hardly ever lose. We found out that Washington, D.C. tour guides had sued and won for freedom of speech. And then we said, well, that's what we need to do.
While a court was considering the case, Savannah repealed the law.
Vindicated.
According to the U.S. Supreme Court, in most settings, the presumption is that whatever the government's doing to you is legitimate, and the government doesn't even need to explain it. Boy, do I disagree with that. That is exactly the opposite of the way it was supposed to be and the way the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution lay it out for us.
That doesn't mean, though, that states can't pass laws on smoking or seat belts or wearing helmets when you ride down the street, but it takes a lot to get me there. There is a presumption of liberty in our Constitution, in our way of life, and that needs to be protected.
In other words, government has to explain itself to individuals, not the other way around. That's the presumption of liberty.
The one thing I learned is that most people don't know what their rights are.
It's all too easy for city council or the county commission or the state of Georgia to say, this is reasonable, and so we're going to pass a law. And I'm busy doing laundry and carpooling and getting the dog to the vet, and I don't have the first clue where to go to protect my constitutional rights or the energy or the money. And so that slippery slope just starts, and all of a sudden it's gone and you don't realize that that's what's happened.
All right, well, here we go, part 2. More constitutional issues and precedent to consider and discuss. So where I want to start with the second part of the conversation is with the fourth branch. And we know that if you look at the Constitution, Article 1, legislative, Article 2, executive, Article 3, judiciary, there is no article for the fourth branch of government. So does the existence of the administrative state present separation of powers issues?
Absolutely, I think. I think I'm not quite sure on the statistic. I might get this wrong, but I believe the video said that every day the average American commits X amount of felonies and doesn't even realize it. I definitely do think that we've at least gotten to ourselves into a position, whether it's the Department of Education and Title IX regulations, or I work a lot on free speech issues, and you've seen a lot of executive orders come out on that, or a whole host of things. Americans now have a shadow government that are creating regulations and doing things and putting out memos that the average, none of us know who they are. We did not elect them. And these things are still going on regardless of what law is repealed or what budget has not been passed. These things still continue to operate and happen. So I used to work in Congress, full disclosure, and one of the first things that they would do is with all of the new member orientations, one of the top questions you would get is having the Congressional Research Service come in and actually telling members how much of, as legislators, they actually had control of. And in the legislative branch, there's not much. Now, part of it's their own fault. They have, I think, my own personal opinion, I think Congress has spent a lot of the 20th century kind of giving over its authority to some of the administrative branch, our state, just so it doesn't have to take ownership. And I think you see the consequences of that, whether we're talking about, running on continuing resolutions, not passing a budget, constantly having to deal with this constant infighting and turmoil in Congress. Part of that is because they are so far removed of the actual regulations and the things that are happening that they also don't feel like they can do anything to change it. And I do think it's definitely gotten out of control, at least in the legislative branch, because so much of what they say, they might say, everyone makes sure that everyone has puppies, but depending on what the Department of Education says, all of a sudden you have a puppy, a tarantula, and a spider, and nobody knows who's actually writing that and what that process is. And unless you're a dork or really involved and you're submitting your, public comments and your coalition letters, the average American has no idea, what the process is to putting your opinion out there on regulations. And that whole process, I think, is just, disgusting. I think a few years ago, we were celebrating the fact that Congress would put up bills for 3 days online to give us, as the American people, a chance to read it, as if that's something that we should be celebrating, right? Of course, you should be talking to me every day and having this conversation, but instead we've just surrendered so much of our liberty and our legislators' responsibility to an unaccountable, unelected branch.
Okay. What does it do? I mean, oftentimes the Constitution is described as creating a federal government of limited and enumerated powers. So I wonder if as a result of the creation of and growth of this fourth branch has somehow undermined or I guess destroyed in some ways that description of what the federal government is supposed to have control over as compared to the states.
Yeah, I just before I got into that, I just wanted to quickly agree with what the first part of what Shelby was saying in terms of excuse me, in terms of the people not knowing what how these what these rulemaking procedures are. And no one really having an idea of how powerful these agencies can be. I was in the Human and Civil Rights Clinic for our law school at Howard, and that was the first time I had ever even heard of a public comment letter. And I was like, I cannot believe that I'm a 2L in law school who is just for the first time hearing about public comment letters, and how I can almost guarantee if you're not a part of a homeowners association or some other super specific group, that is working, for people or things like that, you don't even know these processes and procedures, nor even where to go, to either fix an issue that the government is not paying attention to or try and get the government off of your back. Now, where I fall on that is definitely nuanced, but I just wanted to agree with her point on that. And in terms of what you were asking, I believe that, excuse me, I believe that that Congress has ceded too much power to these agencies, and I don't think that they even want that power back, to be quite honest.
Oh, okay. It might interfere with their other main job, that is raising money to run for office again.
Correct. Too many.
Ding, 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 ding.
Yes, I think it's just and I'm someone who is for a strong federal government. However, there needs to be the appropriate checks on what these agencies can do, especially when their rulemaking has the power of law in so many instances.
Mm-hmm. And the idea that they are just subject to, I mean, if we find setting aside the cases that might interpret it, they are just subject to an act.
Correct.
Right? The Administrative Procedures Act, that's supposed to be sort of the sum total of what governs how they do what they do. But yeah, it's problematic. I mean, and that indicates the extent to which Congress has divested itself of authority or delegated it. But it seems that given the unique sort of mix, right, of what it is that administrative agencies' functions are, they've got a little bit of legislative, they've got a little bit of executive, and they've got a little bit of judicial.
Right. And you know, if you wanted to know what's going on in our military conflicts, you wouldn't ask your congressman who, you know, with their colleagues have the power to declare war. You would go ask the Department of Defense. If you wanted to know about, you know, your environmental regulations, you would go ask the EPA. You wouldn't email your congressman, and so many other things.
And that's basically how Congress functions. As a former Hill staffer, that's what you spend a lot of your time doing. If you get a call from a constituent and it's, you know, whether it's COVID right now, I haven't gotten my unemployment check in 18 weeks. The first thing that person is assigned to do is to contact the administrative branch. And that's a problem, right? The fact that I've elected this person to represent me and they can't tell me what's going on. So they have to put me in touch with the department in DC, by the way, not even in my district, not even in my state. And they're the ones that are going to have more information than my actual legislator.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that there's no way that legislators could possibly know what's going on. You know, the Constitution's a little pamphlet. The US Code is a bookshelf about this wide. And the Code of Regulations covers a wall that's 8 feet high and 8 feet wide. And so that does make the point about how the administrative agencies affect our lives a lot more. And there's no way that a person could just know that. But also, if we're going to have a complex, modern administrative state economy, we have to have administrative agencies. Now, you could put them under the legislature, but does that do anything better than putting them under the executive? So I don't think that the problem is where they are placed. I think that we have a host of problems, accountability, and part of that was that, remember, Congress in over 300 of its statutes said that we are having a string on all of these agencies that we can pull at any time to overturn any of their regulations. And the Supreme Court undid that when it said that no, anytime they tried to undo a regulation, if Congress wanted to do that, they had to follow the presentment clause, meaning they had to have both houses pass it and the president sign it. Whereas what Congress had said, we're delegating power to these agencies saying, you guys go do this. It's too complex for us to decide whether carbon dioxide should be. And so we're going to delegate that, but we're keeping a string on it for when we get enough constituent complaints that we can pull that string and undo that reg. And the Supreme Court undid that. And so now we have, that's really, really messed up the balance from the delegation. Now, do I think that this leads to the conclusion that we should have a constitutional convention? Yeah, that's exactly where I think this leads. We've got to rethink these things. We have to rethink, where does this go, and give power to Congress to directly enforce the 14th Amendment rights and throw some affirmative rights in there. So yeah, I think we have lots of things to do, but the Supreme Court played a part in the current mess in terms of the lack of oversight by Congress. And those are just some, you know, it's a very, very complex picture. And I think that the points made, I agree with them in terms of that there's lots of bureaucrats, there's lots of petty bureaucrats, and petty bureaucrats are the worst, right? They have a little bit of power and they go crazy with it. And that has to be restrained. How we do that, haven't got all the answers just yet.
And in defense of
the petty bureaucrats,
no, I mean, I think they do important work that, you know, has to be done on a national level. So, you know, I get that they're in kind of a difficult position, because if you want to do something nationally, you have to set some sort of rules for all of these states to follow. However, I think that the water has been murky in terms of going too far and trying to kind of legislate and legislate locally, that kind of makes people's lives a little bit more difficult, or just completely unchecked from the power that they are supposed to be governed by.
Gregory, I think you make a great point, and it was, I'm paraphrasing, but basically the idea of what is it that we want our Congress and our federal government to actually focus on. And I do think a lot in our national conversation, we look to the feds for solutions to everything, but people don't understand that, at least for the majority budget-wise, 80%, whether we're talking about education, police reform, you name it, domestic policy for the most part is a state thing. And I think in general, it's a lot easier for me to hold my local official accountable than it is for me to hold my US Senator for Virginia accountable, or my Senator for Michigan accountable, because there's so much cover in the molasses of nobody really knows what their job is supposed to be in Congress. But right or wrong, at least with your state lawmakers, and I used to do a lot of state legislative work, one of the real positive things I'll say about our federal system is that your states, and particularly your state lawmakers, just don't have that luxury to play dumb. They're only in session 30 to 60 days a year, and they have actual budgets that they have to get fulfilled. They can't just dismiss it like they can in DC. So I do think that there might be but a return to people, being more busy and seeing the consequences of a government not functioning. And I think COVID has really highlighted that, whether you're in a 2-parent household in a suburban school district, but your local school still can't get Skype to work, or you're from a city like me in Detroit and you have a lower, more impoverished or victimized communities. But every American is starting to look at their leaders, regardless of which side, and say, well, wait a minute, what are you people doing? And I think the biggest example of that is probably our tech policy. Regardless of what hearing you see, you've got people that just do not understand the 21st century. And we already know it takes forever for laws to catch up to society. So I think the more and more you see the dysfunction, the more obvious it becomes that they're not operating in a way that's effective for the majority of us.
All right, so Shelby, you open the door. So the video clips that were featured in the second part, we were talking about the fourth branch, as it were, but the last clip, and then we'll come back to the middle one, right? The last clip seemed to focus on state and local governments going too far, right? So the idea that at the local level, people, whether they understand their constitutional rights or not, right? Because that's part of it. At the local level, it seemed that, the tour guides in Savannah found it to be absolutely ludicrous that Savannah would regulate them, and felt that the way you get rid of bad tour guides in Savannah is to let them give bad tours, and then let's say it goes on Yelp and they get really bad reviews, so then the market will correct that, right? They won't get any business, because the demand for their business will in fact shrink. What's the way to go? Can we leave things just to the market?
No, not at all. I think what most people, don't want to address is that a lot of times when local governments or states, but particularly local governments, do these things, this has nothing to do usually for what they're trying to say the intent is. You see this a lot every single time whenever a government or a college campus tries to restrict free speech, for example. They always jump to public safety, right? And that's what this is. But usually what it is, if you really look in the devil of the details, it's we have to find a way to generate revenue. And what a great way to generate revenue than to come up with a reason why some bureaucrat has to get involved with whether I can braid my sister's hair or not, or whether I can talk about history, because guess what? You've already funded your public schools that were supposed to be teaching me history in the first place, so I should be able to give the tour. Yes. But I think, again, it's like what Benjamin Franklin said at the end of the documentary, and what we all know, none of this works. Only a dictatorship works when you only need one person to know what's going on, right? A republic, a democracy, unfortunately requires all of us to always have to do homework, and you always have to be on. And regardless of what your political affiliation is, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, if you are in government, eventually your innate human nature is going to lead you to say, I know what's best for other people because I'm the government. Right. And unless the people are constantly remembering that, no, usually when they say they're there to help you, it's probably not what you think it is. It's always going to lead down a path of how can I get more from the individual person.
Right. And good to see you back, Steve.
Yeah, I have two possible connections and one of them dropped off. The other one seems to be okay for now.
Okay. So now this takes me back to what I might have found to be the most interesting, the most provocative, I'll put it that way, of the three clips in the second part. And that is the one to which Shelby referred when Ben Franklin gets asked, you know, what's up? And it's basically the quote is, we gave you a republic if you can keep it. And it does tie back in some ways to part of the conversation we had in the first part around Brown, for example. One thing that didn't come out of Brown was the foundation of a constitutional right that recognized education as a fundamental right. And we've already discussed the problems created and the inequities maintained by relying on local property tax revenue to, in fact, fund schools. What struck me in looking at the video was that people who become naturalized citizens are expected to know and demonstrate knowledge about things that the vast majority of people who are birthright citizens have no idea how to answer those questions, right? Should that be the case, right? Should birthright citizenship just come along with this presumption that because you were born here, somehow you are going to get the information that you need in order to participate in this thing the way the framers apparently intended? And I know that this can be troubling if you go all the way sort of to its logical conclusion for some, and that is, well, yeah, that's the reason why suffrage, for example, was exclusive, right? Or wasn't universal in the first place. But I'm not advocating, taking away people's right to vote. I'm just trying to advocate figuring out how they have a right to be educated, and with that right comes a duty. Right?
Yeah.
And is it fair to assume that people who want to become naturalized citizens come to the table knowing less about the United States and the United States government than the people who just so happen to be born here?
Gregory, go ahead.
Well, I don't.
Please,
yeah.
Go ahead, Professor.
Okay. I think that we have a real problem of keeping the republic, and a republic means a government, in Lincoln's phrase, by the people and for the people, and not by the oligarchs and the people for the oligarchs. And we're having trouble keeping that. And we're having trouble keeping liberty because all of those regulations limit our liberty, and they happen down at the petty level of the homeowners associations and the local governments, at least as much intrusive as the federal government. So liberty's tough to maintain, republic is tough to maintain, and at least the one thing we should be able to maintain, I think, is democracy, and we're having trouble maintaining that. And that's what we see with the Supreme Court, allowing gerrymandering, allowing all these restrictions on voting, and allowing the exclusion of voters. I think that is a critical aspect that has been left out of this documentary thus far, is the importance of that, and out of the Supreme Court, is the importance of protecting democracy along with liberty, because democracy is critical to that republic. And again, I think our Constitution is badly, badly broken. We need a new constitutional convention.
I would say that that for a couple, yes to your question, for a couple of reasons. One is, well, I think the problem is, we get to the problem for a couple of reasons. One is that people revere their politicians in a way that's unhealthy, or very much so, like, oh, this person must be so smart, they must know a lot because they're a congressman or a state legislator or a blah, 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 whatever. And I've worked in state legislatures and I've worked in Congress, and I can tell you that those people are no smarter than the people that I, get a haircut from, or the people that I buy my sneakers from, or whoever else. I can promise you there is no drop off in intelligence. The only drop off is interest in the government and interest in legislating, which often equates to an interest in power. And that's what it really is. And so I think that's number one. Number two, I think civics education has dropped off a lot in terms of our public schools. So I think that's why people aren't even aware of certain rights that they have, and ways that they can participate in their democracy. And I think that falls on several different people's laps: the school system, parents, people individually. And for the second part of your question about people being born here not knowing as much as people who are trying to gain citizenship, I don't even think the people who make our laws and participate in our democracy directly know as much as the people that are required to. So I wouldn't even put it to the common man. I would put it to the people in power, and the people that are responsible for the laws and daily politics. So yeah, though, that's my thoughts on that.
I do think there is a silver lining in the fact that, like most human beings, it's human nature to take something for granted until you see it threatened. And so for obviously a lot of people coming over from countries that might be in a worse economic situation, or attacks on religious liberty, what have you, throughout history, and why they chose to come to this country versus where they were from. I just think that's probably just a natural thing, right? So if you were someone who experienced domestic violence, you're going to be more sensitive to male dominance or physical abuse, or things like that. You're going to be more aware of something when it's impacted you. And I'm hoping that through COVID and what we've seen happen, whether it's your business being shut down and no one trusting the data coming from anybody, that people have started to say, you know what, wait a minute. Just because some ex-leader said that there's a problem, this means more, because now it's impacting me. And it's making people look more at their laws. It's making people, I've had friends just start recently saying, oh, I didn't know my DC mayor or so-and-so had these emergency powers. Well, yeah, they do. And we need to start having a conversation about what is the definition of an emergency? Is it for 9 months? I don't know. But I think, like anything in American history, unfortunately, like all of us as humans, sometimes you have to fall on your head and get beaten up a lot before you realize, like, oh, this is dumb, or this isn't the right way to go. Very rarely do we just, learn the lesson before the consequence.
All right, so perhaps, depends on how generative this question is. This might be the last one. And that is, I'd like to ask all three of you if, and no, it's not a rhetorical question, are there contemporary examples of the threat to the Republic? And what comes to mind? Speech, particularly dissenting speech, assembly, petitioning the government regarding your grievances, association. I think that with the advent of Black Lives Matter, there began to be this idea that the dissent piece of it, expressing your discontent, as it were, was taken by some as being un-American, right? And as we have moved through this period where the vast majority of us, at least on this call, have been on lockdown, we have watched a lot of folks go out and protest, but some folks are calling them terrorists. Some folks are calling them, claiming that they're threats to national security and our public safety. I'm just wondering, have Franklin's chickens actually come home to roost?
Well, so I'm going to make 2 quick points. The first is I am much more concerned about the lack of value of appreciation for free expression culturally in this country overall. I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. The reason I do the work that I do is because I have fought against bills where people wanted to say, let's get rid of Black Lives Matter because that's a hate group. And the exact same week, someone's saying, I want to shut down this group because I don't like that they're pro-life. I find that hateful. Mm-hmm. I defend the stuff that I hate because I'm selfish, right? And I want to be able to talk. And I'm pretty sure the things that I believe in or think might offend somebody. And what I'm more concerned about now is that we're creating a culture where it doesn't matter how many court cases that we win legally to protect the First Amendment. If too many people are associating free speech or the First Amendment or your liberties to hate or barriers and not this opportunity to progress and to make sure that someone that looks like me that couldn't do the work that I do 30 years ago now has an opportunity to, and that offends a lot of people, right? That I could be where I am would have been offensive to someone before. Mm-hmm. I'm generally concerned that the free speech that someone doesn't like now becomes blanket okay for everybody. So whether it's, okay, I think it's disrespectful to kneel, so I'm not going to allow that, or it's, oh, I think it's disrespectful to say that Blue Lives Matter. Everybody on each side now is, I think, focused on this ideal that it's okay to silence things that you do not like. Mm. And it's through that dissent, it's through those exchange of ideas that it's the only way we are going to progress. And you can shut down whatever you want, but I'm just terrified of, who's it going to be? Do we want Donald Trump doing that? Do you want a Hillary Clinton doing that? I don't care who it is. I don't want any of them doing it. But if we all keep doing it, it doesn't really matter what they do. That's what I'm more concerned about, is if we don't believe in it, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the progress is, what the social justice term causes. If we don't believe in it, we're just sitting here, running our mouths for no reason at all. So I think it's just much more important that we focus on, why is it so important that these things matter? Why are we having a conversation about the Constitution today? Because regardless, every generation has looked at it and said, look, you're being a hypocrite. Let me make you uncomfortable and let's duke it out, hopefully peacefully, and get to a better place.
Right.
I would say my my contemporary, I guess, example of a threat or of the threat is so this summer we saw a lot of protests, and in general in the past, I would say 5 to 6 years, we have seen a lot of protests. And each time that there is a protest or a mass demonstration of some sort, there's some sort of police response, or some sort of enforcement response, whether it be police, whether it be the National Guard, whoever. Mm-hmm. And no one on television, no one even at the rallies sometimes even asked, like, why is there law enforcement here? The First Amendment clearly states, and I have it right here, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And unlike a lot of other amendments where they have, except, but, in the case of XYZ, it's just the free exercise thereof. And like, that's it. There is no, it's just that clause right there. And so the fact that we are okay with even police showing up, or some show of force by a governor, or some show of force by an executive, the most recent example being the president, mm-hmm. And that we don't have lawyers on television saying this is not okay, this is not legal, or we don't have lawyers arguing that that's a Third Amendment violation, because those are our streets. Those soldiers are being quartered in our streets, and so just the fact that we're not even appalled to see such a violent show of, even when it doesn't turn violent, but to see such a strong show of force against people who are exercising their right to protest, their First Amendment right, the most unique American right, specifically because we were born out of protest, is what I think the true threat is. And I think it is a slippery slope. And I hate using that phrase, but it just is. I think it's a slippery slope into authoritarianism when people start to, start shifting that window to like, oh my gosh, there's police presence out there. But now it's no longer, oh my gosh, there's a police presence. Oh my gosh, they're beating protesters. Now it's not that. Now it's, oh my gosh, they're throwing protesters into vans. So now that all right, now they're just beating the protesters, that's fine. Now if they're just showing up, that's fine. When they shouldn't be there at all.
At all. All right, so I knew that this time would come much quicker than we would have expected, but we have managed to talk our way through our entire program. I want to thank first all of you who came to join us. And I tried to work in some of your questions, and hopefully we got some of the answers touched on some of the things that were raised in the chat. I've been asked to remind you to complete the survey that is available in the OVEE chat. You can also go to WHUT.org for more information. I would also like to say thank you to, I'll go the other direction, Steve, Shelby, and Greg. I really, really enjoyed our conversation, and perhaps we can, in fact, do this again sometime in the future. Best of luck to everyone. Everyone stay safe, and happy Constitution Day.
Happy Constitution Day.
Our Constitution is only as strong as the people.
I voted.
I voted.
Today, almost 400 new citizens taking the oath to the Constitution. For more than 2 centuries, Americans have fought to establish liberty, expand liberty, and preserve liberty. Join me, Doug Ginsburg, on a personal journey as I explore our more or less perfect union.
Let's roll. How's my hair? You ready?
I'm ready. Oh my gosh, I'm nervous now.
I hope you find something shocking.
No! Yes.
How fantastic!
I'm rearranging all of the stories I've ever been told. Everything's sort of recalculating, recalibrating.
This is tripping me out. Oh my God, this is blackmail material.
It's getting very emotional.
You want to find them, and here they are listed as property. But then to see them scream out on the census, no, here's my name.
Those words, man. I felt those words when I read them.
I just kind of wish I could go back in time and fix things.
But imagine this, your grandfather lives under the radar for 16 years.
In America.
Illegally.
Wow.
To be an immigrant is to be as courageous as it comes. So I take great pride in the courage that they had to take a chance on America.
Who knew it was going to be this heavy? Man.
It's weird that in some ways you're pining for something.
Yeah.
It's not just information, you know? You feel a reach. I feel a reach from this.
You're descended from a patriot.
That's the best news I've heard all day.
Makes me feel like a badass.
John S. Worrell is charged with fornication. I like him.
It's kind of dramatic, though. It sounds like a movie scene I'd write.
That is some twisted family history.
This is the point where you reveal I'm not even human. You're from another planet.
European.
You are 1/3 white.
I am not.
You are 1/3 white.
Take that back.
I know we've been a great big melting pot, and I don't mind being melted.
You want to meet your cousin?
Please tell me it's Oprah. I will be so excited.
You and my father are DNA cousins.
Oh, my brother! There's something so empowering about knowing where you've come from, where you descended, what your story is.
It fills in the blanks for me in terms of, where I got the chutzpah to do what I do.
This is the American dream, right?
It is.
This is worth more than anything. This is priceless.
This is my new favorite book.